Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your time in talking with colleagues at our breakouts and got a short opportunity to grab some additional beverage or some snacks. Just want to share a quick logistical note. We put some information in the chat on an update for some technical difficulties that some of you are having with the Safari browser. We believe that if you use a different browser, your experience could be a little bit better, but there's some information that'll be shared there in the chat. It's my pleasure really now to moderate a conversation with several members of our Funder Advisory Board. For the past 4 years, the Ascendium Education Group, Kresge Foundation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have provided both financial and strategic support to the Strong Start to Finish network. As Raheem mentioned in his opening video comments, during the past few years, these foundations have really transformed the way they're working together and how they are engaging their key partners and with all of us as a network, as well as the broader educational reform movement space. So I'm really excited to explore this transformation and some other topics with our panelists today. I'm pleased to be joined by 3 members of the Funder Advisory Board. Sue Shui is a Senior Program Officer at Ascendium Education Group. Bill Moses is the Managing Director of Education at the Kresge Foundation. And Rebecca Halitzer is the Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome to each of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us for today's conversation. I want to remind everyone that as part of the process of registering for this event, you had an opportunity to submit some questions that you would like me to ask to our Funding Advisory Board members. And we'll certainly have an opportunity to get to those questions here in a moment. But I did want to start with a question for Bill. Bill, the first thing I want to say is you've already earned yourself a gold star for the biggest effort to join us today. So for our participants, Bill is joining us from his vehicle in a parking lot outside of a local library via a mobile device. So really taking on the lived experiences of far too many of our students and even some faculty members, particularly during this pandemic. So Bill, thank you very much for making the effort to join us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, so I want to start with a question for you, really just given where the developmental education reform Bill, I want to start with you, just sort of a question about where you see the developmental education reform field now compared to maybe where we were 4 or 5 years ago when we started this work. You've been a part of this collective effort for a long period of time. And so curious on some of your reflections about some of the collective transformation that's gone on, either in terms of how philanthropies engage one another or some other changes in the policy and practice field that you'd like to comment on.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian. And yes, I'm delighted to be speaking from an unidentified automobile in front of the Northville Public Library. 10 points to anybody who can guess what kind of car I'm in. But when Uri Treisman really started this work about a dozen years ago, he talked about a joyful conspiracy and this idea that we were going to take this horrible problem of developmental education, particularly developmental math, which, I was thinking about this, it's kind of like an invasive species that, you think it emerges, it's spread around, you try to get rid of it in your yard, but it's in someone else's yard, or maybe even better, it's like a pandemic. And it's as if somebody wasn't in charge or wasn't doing their job and just said everybody should just do it on their own from every county, town, and state, and that somehow we'd get it solved. And so what really, I think, is the critical factors in what we've done with Strong Start to Finish and with the developmental education reform movement over the past dozen years is really 2 things. One is collaboration. And, in the early years, we've worked, it was Kresge, Gates, Ascendium, Hewlett, Lumina, Carnegie Corporation, lots of foundations have been involved over the last dozen years. But in the last 4 or 5, what we've done with Strong Start to Finish is really focus our energies to try to support the main reform movements that have been developed over time, that have proven success rates, that have clear outcomes. And what we've done is we've thought, how could we get this to really, really scale? And how could we get everyone to adapt it and adopt it all over the country so that we can prevent students from wasting so much time, so much money from getting to their higher education dreams? And I think this collaborative approach from the foundations, but also from community colleges and public institutions and some private across the country. This has been really important. And I think we're getting to a point where we've got almost a critical mass to really turn it over and say that the developmental education model that most students suffered through is if not now, soon will be the minority model, not the reform model we're trying to spread. And I think the other lesson from this has been the strategic consistency. It's not been rote and we just do exactly the same thing. It's this idea that we're all we have the same goal and we're using basically the same tools to get there, but we're adapting them to see what works best. And I think that's really been what's happened most of the last several years. And I couldn't be delighted to see so many institutions participating and, really living up to that joyful conspiracy that Uri had envisioned a dozen years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate you bringing that turn of phrase back to our top of mind. That was certainly one of the foundational language pillars on which our work has been built. Sue, I want to turn to you for our next question. And this is one that came to us from some of the pre-event survey work we've done from participants. And I imagine Rebecca and Bill, you might also have responses to this question as well. We've worked hard as a network over the past 12 months to adapt our work, to think about how to change our practice in response to the conditions of COVID and other social pressures. But when you think about those pressures over the last year, what about your organization in particular has changed? And what do you think has changed permanently in response to the events that we've witnessed over the past 12 months?
So much has changed. I'll bring up two things that, two areas of change that I think might be the most relatable to others in this network. I think one is the relationship that we have with each other as colleagues. There's something really magical about being able to see even more of each other, seeing each other's lives, their partners, pets, children, what have you, in the background, seeing the insides of their cars and various nooks that they have in their houses has really lent this this move to just give each other more grace and understanding. And that's important because the 2020 really tried to do us in, and to an extent 2021 as well. But that trust, that relational trust that we've been building as a team, as colleagues, as professional colleagues, is really critical in order to have some of the more challenging conversations that we have to continue to have around racial equity challenges that the country still faces and will continue to face. So our relationship with each other has changed, certainly in step with our relationship with technology. We're looking at ways to better facilitate learning and communication, as are many of our grantees and college partners. And there's no shortage of new tools that are on the horizon and are available to use now. But I think one change that we've been making is acknowledging where we might need to cut back on some of these new tools. Every now and then, a good old-fashioned conversation conference call where you can, plug in your headset and pace around the house seems like it's the most effective way to go. So I think just overall, being really plugged in to each other and the organizations that we're working to support really means kind of taking time to see where folks are at and to be really vulnerable in talking about what the needs are. So I'll stop there, but I'm curious what my colleagues might say.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And Rebecca, I might turn to you to invite you into this conversation. We heard about trust and different types of connection points that Sue mentioned. What about from your perspective at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? What's some things that have changed for you in the last 12 months?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Sue mentioned our little cubby holes. This is the stairway going up under this. So that familiarity with where people live and how they live, I can totally see that. And in terms of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, definitely one of the biggest probably most permanent changes for us on the post-secondary team has been a stronger emphasis on racial equity and racial justice. And so we're actually internally refocusing our investments, who we invest in, what we invest in, how we invest in, to focus on making sure that we are improving how our institutions serve, Black, Latinx, Indigenous students. We're being very specific now. We no longer say students of color, and also students experiencing poverty. And it's really exciting and at the same time very challenging, because we know that we don't necessarily have the expertise and capabilities and capacities that we need, and so we're having to bring that in so that we can do this work well as intentionally. And that's probably one of the biggest changes for us, for sure. I'll throw it over to Bill.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of looking at racial equity in the developmental education space has been critically important, because we know historically people had to live in certain neighborhoods. They often had access to inadequate educational foundations. And so when they went to college, they typically ended up going to developmental education, and they weren't being well served. And I have to say that I think one of the reasons why this was such a chronic problem was it was not a problem of elite education or elite students. So it wasn't a priority for higher education as a whole. And I think that when foundations and institutions and systems said, no, we've got to make it a priority, it was a critical shift. The challenge has been, though, is that we still see racial outcomes gaps. And I think that while it's better to be part of the reform movement for your students, it's not quite as good for students of color, particularly African Americans and Latinx students, as it is for many white students. And so figuring out, what are the reasons why some students are succeeding, what are the ways in which we could address that, I think have become really critical. But again, when we think about the pandemic and then the sort of the racial justice reckoning we've had, to me, developmental math, developmental English is critically important, because this is the opportunity we are giving back to people so that they can fulfill their academic and professional dreams.
Yeah, Sue, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, just on particular thinking about the way in which Ascendium has thought about, sort of responding to the broader collective conversation that we've certainly been having as a network, but more broadly within higher education and then certainly society around sort of the reckoning with injustices and how we're trying to address those in appropriate ways, both personally and professionally?
Yes, it's a topic of conversation, and it's continued to be since I joined Ascendium. And we've certainly gotten deeper in our understanding of the challenges and the ways that we can participate in collective learning about how to work with existing systems. We've taken some time to acknowledge the roles that we play in this existing system. So the way that students relate to the cost of college is something that we have a hand in. The way that students are have access to their local colleges or looking for online options. These are the spaces that we work in. And the role that we play now is very much one where I think folks are expecting more of us. Our colleagues in philanthropy certainly are. And when we have conversations with grantees, they do ask us how equity plays into our overall strategies. And it really doesn't cut it anymore to say that equity plays a part in every part of our strategy, because I can point to places where it has been still sort of a learning curve for us to really operationalize the things that we as a team have been talking about for a while. But it's an honor to be part of this journey, to be on this journey with so many others, and to be in a network where learning and iteration and fine-tuning is so emphasized. and know that the work is never really done. But the more that we can sort of open ourselves up to look at ourselves critically, as well as others, and to invite others to reflect on what they see in the work that we do, I think that is really staying true to our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially inclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I really appreciate you, mentioning that. And one of the things that is important, I think, as part of our continuous improvement cycle and cycle of reflection and learning on past practice is looking at, what are some of the evidence points we're looking to as a network to identify forward momentum and transformation, and to mark our success and ensure that we are actually, driving the results that we all aspire to do through this work. And so, Rebecca, I want to turn to you specifically kind of on a question that came directly in from our participants as part of the registration process. So one, specific other than the data that we know we can sort of measure student progression and some of the outcome results of different reforms over time, what's some other evidence that you might be looking for as a funder or appreciate learning about that demonstrates the success and value of the work that our institutions and partners and then collectively as a network we're undertaking?
Thanks, Brian. And I do want to say that although there are definitely other data than quantitative data, I really appreciated hearing about graduation rates and the increase in graduate some of our sites are experiencing, because that is actually a piece of data that we can use for advocating for other funders to join this process, or even to maintain or increase our funding and support of Strong Start to Finish. So I just wanted to remark on that. And I also wanted to go back to Judy Marquez-Kiama's statement that she made in the opening that, data defines our equity imperative. And so being able to disaggregate quantitative data, very important and very helpful, but also, going further and gathering that qualitative data, finding out more about the student experience, the faculty experience, leading us to understand some of the causes of those increases so that we can generalize. All the sites have been doing, I was just so impressed this morning hearing the highlights have what they've done in such a relatively short period of time, and just wanting to take that work that they've done and generalize it to other states. Like, for example, Illinois just passed a new policy on DevEd reform. And so being able to take those understandings and then translate that over to another system that may be different, may be the same. And in particular, I really appreciated Todd Sidkamp's comment from Ohio about how the faculty weren't listening to data. We have lots of data that these reforms work, but what he found was that, this peer-to-peer understanding was actually really important, that communication. And another piece of work that's coming out from USC, Adrian Trinidad did some surveys with faculty implementing DevEd reforms, and found out that even in the strong implementer colleges where where the schools were very innovative and took on these reforms, that they that faculty mindset was key. Tom brought that up as well. And that some of the faculty even remarked that if there wasn't a policy, even though they believed in it, they wouldn't have done it. So understanding things like that, and how it helps, how can we learn from faculty and students what works, and from staff, what are those holistic supports? All of that is something that we're looking really forward to using to help scale these, both within and without the sites that we currently have.
Yeah, Bill, what about maybe for you, similar kind of question? Do you think about, besides some of the student level outcomes data that we're able to gather and present, are there other sort of, metrics of change management or thinking about sort of other types of things that would be helpful for us as a network to continue to provide back to you all to demonstrate the momentum and success of our work?
I think one is getting not only the faculty, which I think is critically important, but also changes in systems, confirmation that that the reform-based math courses are getting credit and transferring into other institutions. We had challenges with that on in California, particularly. I think looking also at just more and more states that are interested in this work, that they don't want to be left behind. And I think that this idea that we have been spending so much money at the state level, at the federal level through Pell Grants, and at the personal level through student loans, and it's not been very well spent, to shift this to something that's much more effective and it has much better outcomes for the people who are directing the support to is really helpful. And so having those kind of examples, people who are breaking through. And, on a personal basis, I have a sister who has had to take developmental math tests multiple times because of the way the system doesn't work well for her in California. This is not a criticism of California, but this is just how she's perceived it. And so I think it's really, really important for us to think about how we can both have that qualitative data that sort of looks at big trends and looks at maybe states changing, the quantitative data that shows graduation rates and real improvement, but also even some anecdote that shows how real lives have been changed because developmental math and developmental English have been reformed to serve students better.
Yeah, thank you for that response and insight. So sort of the last question that came out of the stream of questions that we received, and this is probably the most popular sort of theme of questions, was understandably about resources, right? Both for the Strong Start to Finish network itself, but I think it's safe to say for developmental education field more broadly. And I certainly want to be cognizant of not attempting to pin any of you down here publicly. So perhaps more broadly, you could think about the role that developmental education has come to play in state policy approaches that are driving completion numbers, how we've seen the ability of this work to truly advance and operationalize equity in a number of different dimensions. So from your perspective and perch in philanthropy, and if you want to speak about your own foundation's approach, maybe you could let us know as a network sort of where you see philanthropy leaning into developmental education as part of your overall strategies and portfolios. What's the role that plays in the way you're thinking about your grant making moving forward? Because it's certainly been a question of interest for this network. So maybe, I'll ask all of you to respond to that, and maybe we can start with Sue.
Thanks, Brian. The work is certainly not done for as deep of a challenge as this is. We acknowledge that institutional change takes time. It takes convincing people to be part of the effort. And so looking at how developmental education fits into our grant making strategy, it very much is central to the kinds of projects that we are looking to support. I'll just sort of summarize very quickly three main buckets of work that we have at Ascendium in my portfolio, in the Removing Structural Barriers portfolio. So it centers around adopting effective practices and policies for student success, as well as looking at ways to engage diverse change agents. If you take the piece that looks at adopting effective practices, we really need to not only sort of lean into efforts that will expand the reach of some of these reforms that we have seen such amazing results so far, reforms like acceleration, like placement, and reforms around providing differentiated math pathways, just to name a few. The reach of these reforms is something that we are looking to be supportive of. I think I would be hard pressed to find a system or a college that is not engaged in these reforms in some way, but to the extent that these reforms are meeting the needs of every student who is eligible, who needs this work to be done is something that is sort of that last mile work that is really challenging. So that's where we will certainly stay involved, and sort of fine tuning as well on the implementation front is something that we're paying attention to. So iterating on how some of these reforms are implemented so that it makes the impact that we need to see in equitable student outcomes is really top of mind for me, looking at 2021 and moving forward even. So scaling up, fine tuning, and on the engaging diverse change agents front, really leaning into the efforts to support college leaders, middle management, faculty leaders, so that they have what they need in terms of evidence, in terms of case-making materials, and understanding in order to carry this work forward, to make sure that this works financially for the institution as well as culturally. So this is something that we are making room for in our portfolio, and I look forward to hearing more about people's thoughts on how their projects touch on these different things.
Yeah, well, I'm
No
sure people will
sarcasm.
take you. Yeah, people will take you up on that offer. Maybe through the Connect platform here on Pathable in the next couple of days. So, Bill, maybe for you, we could sort of quickly just recap sort of how you're thinking about your commitment to this work moving forward.
So I remain committed, and I think the foundation remains committed to collective action by funders and by organizations, systems, institutions to really put the nail in the old system of developmental education and bury it and get rid of it. And I think we're not quite that, we're close to the critical mass, but we haven't really gone over that line. So I think that's what we'll try to do. I think what's helpful for us to make the case, and it's helpful for institutions within their own states and systems, is really to demonstrate where you've seen real success, where you've seen real progress, especially as it relates to things like graduation rates and to equity, and that you are serving students or more students than otherwise, and where you also see challenges that need to be fixed within the system. And I would say that we have 36 million plus, this is pre-pandemic, comebackers or potential comebackers. And I think, how do we make sure that those people who are more likely than most to need this kind of support, how are we going to support them going forward? And I think of everybody, I hope, listening on this call is part of that solution.
Thanks, Bill. So Rebecca, we'll turn over to you for the last word on behalf of the Funder Advisory Board panel.
Thanks so much, and thanks, colleagues. Listening to Sue, I was like, yeah, that I need to grab her strategy documents. But I appreciated what Bill ended on about how, because of COVID, we have so many students that we need to support in coming back. We need to make sure that at the same time we're continuing to do the work that the sites have been doing in terms of really supporting system and institutional transformation. Our teams are very focused on institutional transformation around developmental education right now, recognizing that it isn't just its own solution. It actually is a part of the structural barriers for racial equity in institutions of higher education. So that's kind of where we are. And I know that I just want to say again how much, going back to the joyful conspiracy, and how wonderful it's been to hear what the sites are doing, and knowing that you all are going to help us continue that collective action going forward.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate it. And we have hit time. So thanks again for the great conversation. And Bill in particular, thank you for making the efforts to be a part of it. Really, really appreciate that. This will be one of the more memorable panels that I've moderated. I do think it's the first time I've moderated with somebody in a car. So it's pretty exciting. We're going to now take a quick break. I will say, Bill, nobody, at least in the chat, guessed your vehicle. So I think your prize is safe. Unless you want to reveal for us, now we're all curious. Bill's working on the mute button. A Prius. There we go. Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us
Imagine
live
everyone's
from the.
surprise.
That's right, from the Prius. There you go. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll come back and close out the first day of our convening by hearing from the inspirational Michael Sorrell, who's the president of Paul Quinn College. He's a nationally known speaker. President Sorrell is going to be inviting us into Big L leadership, a way for us to courageously embrace the challenges of our time. So we'll see you back shortly for the last session of our day. Thanks so much.